Good evening, and welcome to the Fireside Reading Series, brought to you by the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. I'm Peter Borgen, manager of the Hamlin Midway Library. The past couple of years have taken us away from the in-person gatherings that inspired the name Fireside, but we are still so pleased to be able to join you online to share the stories of our Minnesotan neighbors. Last year, hundreds of you gathered virtually for this series, and we are pleased to have you with us again. We look forward to the time that we can again gather at our library and share stories in person. We are excited to share with you that we are working with neighbors and community to create a vision to transform the Hamlin Midway Library into a space that meets the needs and wants of the whole community now and for the next generation. St. Paul Public Library has a bold, community-centered vision for its library buildings: to create spaces that are safe, inviting, affirming, and comfortable for people of all cultures, abilities, and communities. At the end of last year, Mayor Carter proposed and the City Council passed a budget that includes substantial investment to transform the Hamlin Midway Library. We invite you to co-create and co-design the library of the future. Visit our website, www.sppl.org, to learn more and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on opportunities to join in shaping the future of this location. We look forward to working with all of you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event in the Fireside Reading Series. I'm Wendy Worden, the Programs and Services Coordinator for the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you tonight. As we get started this evening, we would like to take a moment and acknowledge the Dakota people as Indigenous keepers of the land from which I'm broadcasting tonight. This land was reserved by the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow Indigenous inhabitants of this land. The Dakota and Ojibwe peoples are the original stewards of stories in this place now called Minnesota, and we at the Friends honor that tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state today. The Fireside Reading Series is the Friends' longest running program, celebrating 28 seasons in partnership with the Hamlin Midway Library. Fireside is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, and special thanks to our newest sponsor, Minnesota United. We're so grateful for your support and your presence here this evening. We will begin with a reading and talk about the book Booth Girls, and then open things up to questions from you. And we will be following up this program with a brief survey to get your feedback, so do be on the lookout for that. We have partnered with Next Chapter Bookseller in St. Paul, and they have created a page with our featured books and will be providing book sales at the in-person event on February 26th. Now, I'm really very happy to introduce our guest this evening, Kim Heikkila. Kim is a teacher, author, and public speaker. She won the Oral History Association's Post-Secondary Teaching Award in 2006, and her first book, Sisterhood of War, Minnesota Women in Vietnam, was a finalist for the Minnesota Book Award, as is this one. She has delivered more than 50 talks about oral history-based research and writing, and she believes in the transformative power of listening and story. Welcome, Kim.
Thanks, Wendy. It's a real pleasure to be here with you tonight and with all of you out there who are joining us on Zoom. Presumably one day we'll be able to gather in person again, but for now this is a good option as we are living in the pandemic world. And it's a real privilege to be with you tonight and to be part of one of the Friends' most longest running and successful events. So thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to actually share my screen here. So as I talk, you can actually look at some other images besides just me. So let me just get this going here. Here we go. Okay. I'm going to make one other adjustment to my screen and we'll get going. Okay. So I am here to talk tonight, as Wendy indicated, about my book that was published and released this spring called Booth Girls, the subtitle of which is Pregnancy, Adoption, and the Secrets We Kept. Booth Girls refers to young women who became pregnant outside of marriage and spent at least a portion of their pregnancy at the Salvation Army Booth Memorial Hospital on Como Avenue in St. Paul, where they delivered their babies. And depending on the time period in which they were there and when they delivered their babies, either went home with their babies in their custody, or, as was more frequently the case in the middle of the 20th century, relinquished those babies for adoption. My mother, Sharon Moore, who you'll see here in just a second, was one of those Booth girls. So the book is really the story about the intersection between my mother's personal experience as an unwed mother, and I know that is a dated term, but since it was the term that was in vogue at the time that I'm writing about, it's the term that I'll use most often tonight. So the book is about the intersection of her experiences as an unwed mother and the history of the Salvation Army Booth Memorial Hospital, as well as the larger cultural context surrounding unwed pregnancy and motherhood in mid-century Minnesota. And the book was really inspired by my realization, my chagrin, after my mother died in 2009, my chagrin to understand and to realize that I had not talked to my own mother very much about her experiences as a Booth girl. I knew about them at the time of her death, but I hadn't spent a lot of time talking to her about her time at Booth. And after she was dead, of course, it was too late. And the real irony of that is that I was trained as a historian of women in the US in the post-war period. And on top of that, as an oral historian, I, by that time was making my life, my career out of interviewing women about their experiences in, various historical settings. And here was my mother who had had these experiences, and I didn't talk to her about it. So after she died and after my first book came out, I thought, and critically, after I became an adoptive mother myself, I decided that I really wanted to start to learn more about my mom's experiences using the tools at hand in her absence. So I used my skills and training as a historian to do some historical research. I interviewed other Booth girls who were at Booth and had their babies there. And I also interwove throughout the book just a bit of my story of becoming an adoptive mother. My husband and I adopted our son from Vietnam in 2006. So the book kind of weaves together these multiple strands and threads and voices to try to really help me understand my mom better in this particular context. So I'm going to start, and I'm actually going to read a short section of the book here. I'm going to switch the slides so you can see an image of my mother, Sharon Lee Moore. The photo on the left is her graduation photo from 1957. The photo on the right is just a couple years later in 1959. So I'm going to read just the first couple pages from chapter 3 called Under the Eaves, but I need to set it up for you just a little bit. So my mom got pregnant in the spring of 1960 when she was a junior at the University of Minnesota. She had dated this man who in the book I refer to as Jack. She had dated him for a few weeks. It was her first sexual experience and she got pregnant. And when she told Jack that she was pregnant, he disappeared. He, I think, literally left the state and my mother never heard from him again. So she was on her own. Her first impulse was to not tell anybody else. She did not want to tell her parents. She did not want to tell her friends. She didn't want to tell anybody. This was a source of shame and stigma at that time. So she finished her classes at the university that spring and got on a Greyhound bus and went to San Francisco. And her plan was that she was going to have and raise her baby there by herself. So she gets out to San Francisco. She spends a few nights at the YWCA on Powell Street and realizes that is an enormous and frightening task to face by herself. So she decides to turn around and come back home to Minneapolis. So the first couple of chapters of the book detail that kind of backstory, including that trip to San Francisco. And chapter 3 picks up with her return to Minneapolis. And I also should clarify that at the beginning of each chapter, I quote from some essays that my mother wrote many years later about her experiences as an unwed mother. She was quite a writer. And so this excerpt that I'm going to read now starts in her voice, and then it will switch to my voice as a historian and a daughter. When I got back to Minneapolis, I had no job, no school, and no money. I had to go back home to my parents, and I did. But I didn't tell them the truth about my situation right away. I knew I couldn't wait much longer, though, because I was starting to show. My plan was to stay at home until my time came, then go to a place in St. Paul called the Booth Memorial Home for Unwed Mothers, have my baby, and give it up for adoption. I had written to Booth and to the Lutheran Social Service, and I was trying to gather up my courage to tell mom and dad. When that bitter day finally arrived, I discovered that mother already knew after intercepting a letter from Booth Memorial. She hadn't told my dad, though, so that was up to me. I don't think mother was terribly surprised at what happened to me because she never seemed to have much confidence in me. But she didn't want anyone else to find out. Not the relatives, not the neighbors, not even my little sisters and brothers. And so I was tucked away in the upstairs bedroom, the one that had been my brother Earl's until he moved out, the one upstairs under the eaves, the only room on the second floor. And then it shifts to my voice. So began the longest phase of my mother's pregnancy, the one when she was hidden in plain sight, when shame and uncertainty and anger and boredom collided in a modest house on Tyler Street. For the next 5 months, my mother's world shrank from the expansive possibilities of California to the stifling space between the knotty pine walls of that room under the eaves. She moved through the rest of the house in an awkward silence about what was happening to her, under strict orders not to discuss the situation with her littlest brother and sister, who were too young to fully understand, or her teenage brother and sister, who might learn the wrong lesson from her example. Those terms, whether arrived at through negotiation, agreement, or command, extended to her relationship with the outside world as well. They defined her existence through the dog days of summer, when neighborhood children staved off the heat by running through sprinklers and sucking on popsicles. They regulated her activities through the crispening fall, as days made bright by red and golden leaves gave way to the ever earlier evening shadows. They prevented her from feeling the bite of winter and appreciating the hushed silence of sparkling cold nights. For the next 5 months, my mother was not to set foot outside the house. This scenario casts my grandparents' house and my grandparents themselves in a harsh light. House turned prison, room turned cell, parents turned guards. But this image does not mesh at all with my memories of Grandma and Grandpa and their house on Tyler Street. I loved making the trek across town to visit them, my mood rising in happy anticipation as the small house came into sight. When the whole family gathered for the holidays, we would fill every nook and cranny, gathering around a long, pieced-together table in the basement, the only room large enough to accommodate my grandparents' 6 children and children-in-law and 13 grandchildren. After dinner and the all-hands-on-deck cleanup, we kids would fan out around the house while the adults visited. This often led us up a narrow set of stairs off the kitchen to that room under the eaves. By that time, it served mostly as a storage room, but it seemed like an adventure land to me. Trinkets and old magazines and worn-out toys lined the shelves along the walls. The room smelled of cold winters and hot summers and yellowed newspapers, its winding path through the piles holding out the promise of hidden treasures. I didn't know that a painful piece of my mother's past also lay buried in those mounds. So that's where I'm going to stop the reading, and I'm going to spend the rest of the next few minutes here talking about the rest of that chapter, because each chapter kind of begins by setting the particular scene and then asking and trying to answer questions that I wish I had asked my mother when she was still around. So the question that this chapter really engages for the rest of it is, how could my grandparents have done that? How could these grandparents that I loved so much have been so cold, or what seemed in retrospect to be so cold to my mother when she was in this very stressful situation? But the answer to that comes through my historical research. And it has to do with what the prevailing understanding was at that time in 1960 of what caused these young women to become pregnant outside of marriage. There had been various explanations offered for the social ill of illegitimacy throughout the 20th century and prior to that. But ranging from ideas that these women were victims of predatory men, to they were victims of a bad environment, to ideas that maybe they were biologically inferior and perhaps feeble-minded. That's, we're getting into the era of eugenic sterilization in the 20s and 30s, or maybe they were delinquent. But by 1960, in the post-war period, the predominant view of young women who became pregnant outside of marriage was that they were neurotic, that they had some psychological dysfunction. This was the era of the rise of kind of psychotherapeutic approaches to social problems. And so a lot of social workers and social and child welfare experts were arguing that these women had a subconscious desire to get pregnant because that baby was going to be the love object on which they could bestow the love that they themselves had been denied by their dysfunctional families. There was one social worker in particular named Leontine Young, who wrote a lot about unmarried mothers. And she, in her book, went so far as to describe many of these unwed mothers as, quote, mother-ridden, which meant that, in her view, these young women were raised by mothers who were domineering, who were withholding of love and affection to their daughters, and who had not themselves adapted to their proper female roles. And so this deprivation affected their daughters so much that it gave them this neurotic, subconscious desire to achieve a pregnancy outside of wedlock in order to achieve this love that they had been denied at home. And you can see the headlines here. One from our local paper, the St. Paul Pioneer Press in 1959, they did a whole series on girls in trouble. And you can tell by the headline here, they are not born bad, that, this idea is setting itself up to be a more benign and compassionate understanding of these young women than previous understandings had been, as is suggested in the headline at the bottom here from True Love magazine. Who is the unwed mother? What is she like? Is she criminal or stupid or just an innocent victim? Well, these folks are saying none of those things. She's just neurotic. And the key to that, the thing that made it seem a little bit more compassionate and hopeful, and that led directly to this, the rising practice of these women surrendering their babies for adoption, was that the idea was that these women could be treated successfully through casework counseling and psychological counseling, so much so that they would achieve a personality adjustment and go on and live the lives they were meant to live. So I'll come back to that in just a second. I'm going to return just for a moment to my mother's story. So, but that whole idea about why these young women had become pregnant outside of marriage and how it was the fault of their parents explains why my grandparents would have been so horrified at my mother's pregnancy and so reluctant to let her make that shame public. This was also the era of the idealized white middle-class nuclear American family, and an unwed pregnancy was cause for extreme shame and blame. And a lot of those blaming, pointing fingers were pointing directly at my grandparents. So my mom spent those 5 months hidden away in that room under the eaves. On New Year's Eve, 1960, my grandmother drove her across town from Blaine to St. Paul and dropped her off at Booth, so that my mom could spend the last couple of weeks of her pregnancy at Booth. And when she arrived in 1961, she arrived at the moment where these maternity homes across the country were at their peak occupancy, including Booth St. Paul. So Booth St. Paul was one of 36 maternity homes for unwed mothers run by the Salvation Army across the country. And there were a host of these maternity homes run by other organizations as well. And so by 1960, 1961, when my mom was there, this is kind of the peak of that maternity home movement. So my mom is in good and numerous company. She has her baby on January 16th, 1961, and surrenders her for adoption. So I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about adoption here, and then I'll try to wind it up so we can open it up to discussion and Q&A. So as you can see from the slide here, by the time my mother has her baby and surrenders her for adoption in 1961, she is in good company. More than 70% of women who are residing in these maternity homes run by the Salvation Army across the country surrender their children for adoption. And that statistic is probably pretty similar to what was happening in other maternity homes as well. It does not apply to women who were having babies outside of the maternity homes, nor does it apply to women of color, which is something we can talk about later if you like. But my mom was in good company at this time. And what's interesting about this is that this is an almost inversion from what the situation had been just 30 years earlier at Booth. So for the first several decades of Booth's existence, the practice of the Salvation Army was to keep mother and child together. In part, depending on the era, in part, that was partly punitive, where some of these social welfare experts said, well, you know, these women made their bed, they have to lie in it, and they are going to raise these children, whether they want to or not. But part of it was also the idea that these women whose morality had been compromised would best be redeemed through the practice of mothering. So why then, by 1960, 1961, has the situation reversed and you have most of these women in these maternity homes giving their children up for adoption? And that has to do in part with that idea of why these women were getting pregnant to begin with, right? They had this neuroses, they had psychological dysfunction that could be treated, and they could achieve a personality adjustment so that they could go on and live the lives they were intended to lead if they relinquished their babies for adoption and put that whole ugly chapter behind them. That was the best solution for the birth mothers. Adoption was also viewed as the best solution for the children because the children would be better off, so the thinking went, if they were raised in a secure, economically viable, properly gendered two-parent home. Again, we cannot overestimate the significance of the pressure of that idealized nuclear American family. So it would serve the child as well, but it would also be the best solution for increasing numbers of white married couples who could not have children of their own and who were seeking babies to adopt. So we also see the expansion of the adoption market in this post-war period. And there have been lots of other people who have written about this as well. And so these are the dynamics that my mother is caught up in when she decides that she is going to surrender her baby girl for adoption after she gives birth in 1961. So many years later, my mother, again, as I said, she was a writer, she wrote this about her idea about why she made the choice to surrender her baby. 9 months of pregnancy doesn't hurt, but 9 months of unwed mother pregnancy can hurt very badly. I made up my mind early in my gestation that I would give my baby up for adoption rather than have it start life as an illegitimate little person doomed to failure because of me. The truth is, I didn't want to take on the responsibility either, which made me feel even more worthless than I already did. So on January 25th, 1961, my mother left Booth. Her baby had gone home in the arms of a social worker, eventually to a foster home for a bit, and then to an adoptive family. And my mother went on to attempt that fresh start that the adoption best solution was supposed to provide. And she did that. She married my father in 1963. He was the only person she told about her first pregnancy, aside from her parents who knew. I was born 5 years later in 1968. My brother was born in 1970. My mom stayed home with us until we went to school, and then she started a long career in marketing at Carlson Companies. So it seems like she went on to have this fresh start and put that chapter behind her. She didn't talk about it for 33 years. And the assumption was that these women, just would forget about their first child. Not true. And it was in 1994 when my mother finally released her secret to the world, mostly meaning to me and my brother, when my sister came to find her. My sister had been adopted. She had been raised as an only child. And she, in 1994, hired a searcher to find her birth mother, my mother. And so they were reunited in June of 1964, late June of 1964. My sister came to Minneapolis to meet with my mom, and that's the picture you see here. And then she went back home. And it was at that point where my mom took me out to eat, out for burgers at the Ground Round in Crystal, Minnesota, and with great hesitation and nerves, told me the story about her first pregnancy and her first daughter, and told me that I had a sister, and told me that the sister was coming back in about a week to meet me and Eric, my brother, and also told me that, by the way, your sister's name is Kim. So my brother does in fact have two sisters named Kim. My sister was named Kim by her adoptive parents. So they were happily reunited. The book goes on to talk more about reunions and more about the adoptee and birth mothers' rights movement that crept up in the 70s and 80s. But I'm going to stop it here on this happy note, the story about the reunion of my mother and my sister's appearance in our lives, and open it up to discussion. So I'm also going to stop the screen share.
Thanks. I'm so glad that you sort of grounded us in that particular place with the idea of the change from, this child is going to reform you, you terrible unwed mother, to, oh goodness, you have been so wronged by your family that you need to feel love towards something. That was, it's still like, I don't know, there's still a thread of that in our current culture. I think at least there was, even 20 years ago when I was in high school and young women were falling pregnant, and there was this like, oh, but you know about their family, don't you? Yeah. and I just feel like that stigma is still sort of present, which is just, it's kind of, I don't have a question here. I just have a fascination with the way that all sort of matures and comes to be.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think the hope would be that stigma had significantly lessened by now. But when I was still teaching at St. Kate's, this was a number of years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, I was teaching the core class that St. Kate's has all their students take. And I had a young woman student in my class who, she must have been 19 or 20, and she was a single mom. And for her paper that she was writing for this class, she was writing about the virtues and values of being a single teenage parent. And so she was really writing against that persistent stigma about single parenthood. And to say that is not to say that there aren't, particular challenges that can come with teen pregnancy and with single pregnancy and motherhood. but the stigma that is associated with that is a separate thing, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating stuff. We're going to get right in from Mary, wondering what happened to the Booth Hospital and what it's doing now.
Yes. I think on that slide, I kind of skipped over the fresh start that happened to Booth itself. So my mom was there in 1961, really, in January of 1961. And right around that time, Booth had begun this massive capital campaign because they wanted to expand their facility. Because again, peak occupancy, it's going gangbusters. And so they seek to expand both their hospital and residential facilities. And it's important to note here that many of these maternity homes for unwed mothers were not hospitals. So Booth was both a place for these young women to wait out their pregnancies, as well as a hospital where these women could deliver their babies. So for over the course of many years in the decade of the 60s, they were undertaking this fairly controversial campaign to expand their facilities. And it was controversial for a number of reasons, one of which was that there were various local study groups that were looking at the programs Booth was offering and were saying, they're not really up to date. They're kind of functioning on this outdated model of what services we need to provide these women. And remember, this is happening during the 60s, right? When we have the civil rights movement, we have the counterculture movement, we have the women's movement, the sexual revolution, all these cultural changes that are starting to shift the tide and shift attitudes about what sex is and when and where and who with whom you can have it without having to hide it from everybody. So in 1969, they end up raising all this money. In 1969, they build this big addition, which you can see, this building is still there. It's still on Como Avenue, 1471 Como Avenue. It's still run by the Salvation Army. And you can see the original building, which was built in 1913. And then you can see the addition, which is built in, I believe it was 1969. And then the tide has so changed by the end of the 60s that in 1971, Booth decides that it's not going to function as a maternity hospital anymore. And it sends all of its pregnant residents to the University of Minnesota to deliver their babies there. There had been a long standing relationship between the university and Booth that had dated back to its founding in 1898. But so they closed the hospital in 1971. And by 1973, they closed the unwed mothers program altogether because demand has so declined. We're living in a different world, and these maternity homes across the country to various degrees are kind of going out of fashion. So Booth and the Salvation Army decides to refashion itself into Booth Brown House, which originally was focused specifically on providing services for girls who were adjudicated delinquent by the juvenile courts. Booth Brown House is still its current incarnation, and now it serves as a transitional housing program for young people, not just minors, but young people who are in need of housing and transitional housing services. So it's still there, and it's still run by the Salvation Army. It's just no longer serving mothers or pregnant women specifically.
I didn't know, and as I said to you before this program started, I drove past it frequently, and I was just like, what is this place? So it's fascinating. It's good. Yeah. Cindy, who is proud to know you, says, thanks for sharing with us tonight. Thanks for sharing with us tonight. Can you talk a little about your reaction to finding out you had a sister and how it influenced your own decision to adopt your son?
Yeah, so my decision, so there were a lot of years between me meeting my sister and our decision to adopt our son. My sister came into our lives in 1994. And as I alluded to, my mother, I don't know that I noticed it in the moment because I was, I don't know, 26 or something and kind of self-absorbed with my mom. But boy, she was nervous. She was nervous to tell me and my brother about this sister because, that shame, that stigma stays with you. Even if intellectually you can talk yourself out of it as times change, that is not something that is easily overcome, and certainly not something that you can just forget. So she was really nervous to tell us. And I think both my brother and I had the reaction of, wow, well, that's shocking that, she had this whole past life that we didn't know anything about, and that she had kept this a secret for so long. But that was about the end of it. I mean, we were really curious about our sister. We were eager to meet her. I remember, the day she came to our house, we were, my brother and I went to my parents' house and we're waiting for Kim to show up, and we were all kind of happily nervous about it. My mother was greatly relieved that my brother and I had such a calm and non-judgmental reaction. I know that's not always the case. There are as many reunion stories as there are reunions. Once Kim came back, we just kind of integrated her into our lives. We weren't ever, super close. We were all amicable. I think my mom and Kim stayed in touch quite a bit more than Eric and I did with her. Kim had her son within the year of her coming back. So we had a nephew. And then we just kind of got on with our lives. And, I was in graduate school at the time. I was finishing that. I was teaching. I was writing my other book. And so for a long time, to finally get your question, Cindy, for a long time, I hadn't thought about becoming a mom at all. And by the time I finally did, my husband wanted to be a father since we got married. He was a little bit older than I was. And by the time I finally thought, okay, it's time for us to start a family, we found out we were facing infertility. And this is not too personal, not too private, meaning I've written about this in the book. So, I'll talk about it here. I had really severe endometriosis. So had a miscarriage, and we tried IVF once and it didn't work. And so we were facing the prospect of either not having children or having a family through adoption. And we chose adoption. And for various reasons, we chose to adopt our son from Vietnam. And we did that in 2006. Oddly, I'm not sure how consciously I was making the connection between, my mom and Kim, and then building our own family through adoption at the time. I mean, I was enough so that I asked my mother and my sister, both, to write my son a letter about what their experience with adoption was like. And I haven't read either of them. We have both of them. I have not read either of them. Those are, letters that are between them and my son. But I remember thinking, look, we have all elements of the adoption triad in our family. And now we're talking about the adoption constellation, but we have all members of the triad here in my own family. And I think my sister and my mother will be able to answer some questions and provide some perspectives for my son that I can't as an adoptive mom. So I think there was something unique in that. And I will also say that my mother became the most incredibly doting grandmother to my son that I have witnessed. She, for all the years prior to that I had known her, she had said, I'm not a baby person. And she kind of poo-pooed women who focused primarily on, being mothers and Googling and cooing over babies. And she was just kind of, not for me. And then my son came home and she turned into quite the doting grandmother. And I have to think that for her, it meant something that our son came into our lives through adoption in the same way that she had, seen her first child leave her family. So I have to think that was a special element to their relationship.
Scrolling towards the unmute. So anyway, thank you. I enjoyed that. There were a lot of moments when I was reading your book where I thought these are exactly the people that need to be telling this story, because the experiences are happening from all angles. And even it was your mother's grandmother who had been a midwife. So there was birth,
Yes.
in the home.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a bit about that story, because I found that sort of a fascinating through line as far as your mom maybe going, I know what's coming, kind of.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for asking that. So you may have been able to tell from that short excerpt I read that, that there was some tension between my mom and her mom, my grandmother. It was not always an easy relationship for various reasons, but my mother loved her grandmother. My mom was one of 6 children. And when she was young, probably late grade school, early junior high at the time, her family had fallen on some economically challenging times. They were living in the cities at the time. And so they decided that my grandmother decided to take her 5 kids at the time and move back to her hometown of Echo, Minnesota, to live with her mother. And my grandfather was staying in the cities to work as a bartender during the week, and he would come out and visit them on the weekends. And my grandmother, whose name was Carrie Iverson, ran the Iverson maternity home in Echo for a number of years. So she was a midwife who delivered babies. And so my mom, for those years, I forget offhand how many years they were in Echo, maybe 5 or 6 years. My mom watched her beloved grandmother, welcome hundreds of babies into the world in this maternity home she ran out of her house. My grandmother and her kids, my mom and aunts and uncles, were living in a trailer in the yard, but it was kind of crowded. They had a lot of kids, and occasionally my mom and her brother would sleep in the house where my grandmother ran this maternity home. And so, she would remember, and there was one particular incident she wrote about where she usually, when a pregnant woman was coming to deliver their baby at my grandmother's maternity home, my great grandmother would shoo my mom out of the house. But this night there wasn't time to do that. And my mom, who was quite young at the time, maybe 9 years old, heard this delivery downstairs in the parlor of my great grandmother's maternity home. And it was not an easy delivery. And mom was kind of shocked at, just hearing what a difficult delivery was like. And then nobody ever talked about it afterwards. So it is an interesting through line that, she grew up both with this kind of unique knowledge of what labor and delivery might be like, but also this kind of common silence about it, because nobody really talked to her about it as a child, about what was actually happening or how these people had gotten pregnant. So there was still this, as was happening in many families at this time, this kind of widespread silence about, you don't talk about sex too much at home, except to tell the girls to don't have it and to stop the boys who might want to have it. So yeah, she grew up in this really interesting and complicated situation where she was exposed to it in ways that most kids weren't, but still didn't know too much about what was happening.
Yeah, thank you. I loved that bit of symmetry.
Yeah, yeah.
It was one of those moments where you're like, I can't make this up. It's there.
I know. I feel like there was a second part to your question, Wendy, and now I forgot it. So if there was, you can ask it. Otherwise, we can.
That's fine. Yeah. I don't remember what comes out of my mouth after it comes out half the time.
Great.
It's terrible.
So we're good. Me neither.
Got some wonderful remarks from Sue, who knew your mother, and just saying that, she really loved to and really, really enjoyed being a grandma. And
oh my gosh,
it's just,
she certainly did. It was amazing what a grandmother she turned into. And honestly, after she died in 2009, my son was 3.5 only when my mom died. So he lost one of his best friends, and I remember feeling like, oh no, how am I going to do this without my mom? She was working at the U at the time, as you pointed out, Sue, but part-time. So she spent a lot of time with my son. And I just felt totally overwhelmed. Like, how am I going to do this? I was struggling with being a mom anyway. I did not adapt easily. I don't know if anybody does, but I certainly didn't, to being a mom. And then my mom died. And I just thought, oh no, how am I going to do this without her? And that was part of the impetus behind the book as well.
Never underestimate having good grandmas.
Oh my goodness.
I was blessed with two of them, and I miss them. I was lucky to have them well into my adulthood, but I just a good grandma is it as far as mothering is concerned also.
Yes. Yes, in many, many ways, for sure. Yeah.
So you mentioned this in passing as you were speaking, but I really would like for you to talk a little bit about the differences between women of color in these situations and white women as they were,
yes,
and the different ways that adoption and keeping babies played out.
Yeah, huge difference. And I say in the book right away, I think in the introduction, and usually say this when I give talks about the book, that this story is a white woman's story. And not only because my mom was white, but because the experiences of women who got pregnant outside of wedlock and the children who came of those pregnancies was defined through race and through ideas about race and racism. And in fact, one of the women, Ricky Solinger, who wrote one of the first books that I think was published and that I ever read about these maternity homes, it came out in the 90s. She said that race was the single most important factor that determined what would happen to these single pregnant women and their babies. So, so there are multiple angles in which race played a role in these experiences. One of which was in terms of which women were served by these maternity homes and why. So I don't think I had this slide in this presentation. In fact, I know I didn't, but at the time my mom was at Booth, it was something like 85% of all women served in residence at maternity homes run by the Salvation Army were white, 85%. And in the Central Territory, of which Booth St. Paul was a part, that percentage was even higher. It was like 91.5%. It was overwhelmingly white. That was not necessarily because the Salvation Army explicitly prohibited women of color from taking advantage of their services, although some maternity homes did that. It depended on the region in which these maternity homes were located and perhaps the philosophies and ideologies of their governing organization. The Salvation Army at least publicly stated that it was open to women of all races, backgrounds, creeds, everything. And there is some evidence that in the 60s, at least, and even before that, there were some African-American and Indigenous women at Booth. But by and large, women of color, and I will speak more specifically about Black and Indigenous women, were not part of this maternity home system. Partly because sometimes there was policy prohibiting that, but there was also a different understanding for a good number of years about why those women became pregnant outside of wedlock. That was very different from this understanding that I described in this talk about these neurotic white women with their psychological neuroses. A good many of those same social welfare experts were saying in very racist and explicit terms that, well, these white women, we can help them. They're amenable to treatment. But Black women, that's just what they do. They're just acting out their immutable biological characteristics. So they won't benefit from the services that we can provide them anyway. So we're not going to invite them into these maternity homes that are providing these services. Even when attitudes towards women of color who got pregnant as single women started liberalizing with the civil rights movement and other movements, and some of these social workers were starting to say, no, these women are probably getting pregnant for very similar reasons as white women do, and they too could benefit from the services that we provide. There were also some differences within those other communities, Black communities, and within Indigenous communities that may have made those women less likely to seek out the services of a maternity home anyway. In many ways, particularly in various Native American cultures, single pregnant women and their children were just absorbed by the community. They were absorbed into the community, in Black communities as well. Not everywhere, not all the time, but there was oftentimes a different understanding within those communities about what single pregnancy meant. So for those combination of reasons, these maternity homes really were focused on white women. As for their children, there are, again, multiple angles through which race came to play a part in what happened to those non-white children who were born outside of wedlock. In the event that a woman of color, an African American, say, or a Native American woman, wanted to have their child adopted out for some reason, it was hard to find other adoptive families of color to take those children in. And remember that in the post-war period, at least for a good chunk of it, this was the era of racial matching. So adoptive parents or prospective adopters wanted to adopt children who looked like them because, in part, because there was also shame and stigma associated with infertility and with building a family through adoption rather than through traditional biological measures. So a lot of white adopters wanted to adopt white babies. So babies who were not white sometimes had a hard time finding homes in families of color. But the reality also was that adoption was, a highly regulated practice at this time, run by these adoption agencies that put up many, many obstacles to adopters of color. There were often income requirements that prospective parents had to meet. There were housing requirements. A lot of these adoption agencies would not let a couple adopt a baby unless the mother stayed home. And if you are an African-American married couple, you might rely on the income of both the husband and the wife. So there were enormous obstacles set in front of prospective adoptive parents of color as well. And then eventually there were some programs designed to kind of expand adoption access for adopters of color. There was one in Minnesota that the acronym for which was PAMI, and started trying to recruit Black families to adopt Black babies, and eventually, very quickly, in fact, turned into an emphasis on transracial adoption, finding white homes for Black children. And then, of course, many of you may be familiar with the horrific history of adoption as it played out with Native communities through things like the Indian Adoption Project, which used horrific and exploitative means to take Native children from their communities, from their families, from their tribes, and put them in the homes of white adopters. There are many complicated political and racist reasons for that. But suffice it to say that I can't recall the statistic off the top of my head, but it is an enormous percentage of Native children in Minnesota end up being raised by white families through adoption, which is a really, a troubling practice, and which leads to something like the Indian Child Welfare Act as well. So that was a really long and kind of complicated answer to your question, but it's a long and complicated process and story and history.
Yeah, read the book, everyone, if you haven't, because it's a thread throughout as well. Discussions about different community norms and our long sorted history with assimilationist projects and all of that.
Yep. And frankly, to be very honest about it, that it also that history and those threads lead right to my family, the way my family was formed, through transracial and transnational adoption, which is, got its own problems, and it can be a very uncomfortable space to occupy as somebody who, as a historian, has now come to a different understanding of some of those dynamics, and also looking at my own family and thinking, how did we participate in some of that stuff? So
lots of good Minnesota writers out there talking and writing about these things too. So you can certainly find the moving stories on all sides of it from our very own voices here in the state. It's really great. Goodness, it's like 5 minutes to 8. I really did want to ask you, Kim, about, I think at the beginning of the book, maybe it was even in the introduction, that you speak about, or you write about the way oral history in particular offers some nuance between aggregate populations and individuals. And I thought that was a really stunning and beautiful way to put it. And, there's, because we do often get these broad swaths of generalization, even when we're trying to talk about very particular things. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about your approach as an oral historian to sort of wind us down.
Yeah. I think the benefit of oral history, of course, is that it gives us the lived experience of history that other sources, other methods of research may not, which is not to say that you can't tell really great and personal stories through other kinds of research as well. But oral history allows us to hear and see and experience in our imaginations, through careful listening, what it was like to experience the history that we're studying. And I think one of the ways in which that's really valuable for me as a historian is that it complicates all of those narratives in all the kinds of directions. So there have been a lot of books and articles and movies and newspaper accounts published about this history of these really exploitative maternity homes who pressure these young women into surrendering their babies to the adoption market. And the language of the market is used a lot. And granted, I interviewed a very small number of people, so I don't want to generalize too much. And some of these other books have talked to many women. But none of the women I interviewed quite fit exactly in any of those major narratives that are about the aggregate, which are useful. That's a useful way to understand and to look at history. But it's also necessary and valuable to talk to the individuals who experience and to understand, even like my mom, she, I think even in the excerpt that I included on the slide, she decided to surrender her baby for adoption for multiple reasons, not just because she felt she had no options, not just because she felt cultural pressure to do so, although she probably, both of those did apply, but also because she didn't feel ready to parent. And so I think the value of doing oral history and to talking to the people who lived the history that you're interested in is that it's better able to tease out those nuances. I think it's a really powerful way of learning about the past.
Yeah, I find it very, I don't know. I thought this was a spectacular inroad into the subject matter, the way you approached it through multiple voices as an oral historian, but also as your mother's daughter, was just it was a fantastic approach to something that interests me very much, this kind of this narrow aspect of women's history that I always remember my grandmother saying, when she finally started to talk about her experiences of pregnancy, and just being like, we didn't talk about anything that went on below the neck in my household. And that's been women's history and the experience of living as a woman in a woman's body for a really long time.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think, one of the women in particular that I interviewed for the book, Mary, who has also spoken with me at some of these events. Mary has talked a lot about how liberating it is for her to release this story into the public and to understand. So the value of oral history is that you get the perspective of the individual. The value of oral history oftentimes for the narrator, for the interviewee, is that they can understand that their individual experience was part of this bigger context. And so it can release some of that shame, to understand that, no, it wasn't just you, but you were part of these currents that just swept you up into them. And they shaped your experience as much as you think that you were may have thought you were the master of your own, mistress of your own fate. We're also all caught up in the currents of history as well. And so Mary has been very eloquent in talking about how liberating it has been for her to share her story publicly.
That's fantastic. Well, everyone should read this book because I really enjoyed it. and
Thank you.
And I've enjoyed this conversation very much, and I'm moved by Sue's continuous remembrances
Yes.
of your mother, and I think that's really, I'm glad she is well remembered.
Yes, me too. I'm reading some of your comments, Sue. That's wonderful. Yes, no, she was not plain. She was stunningly beautiful.
Super, super lovely. I love those photos. And I should also tell you, just complete nonsense, but my friend who is 6 feet tall was so thrilled to know that there was a Miss Tall Minnesota pageant, and she wants to bring it back.
Oh, it's still out. Well, I don't know if
good.
the pageant is still out there, but the organization is still out there. The name has changed a little bit, but yeah, it's still out there.
Okay, well, Marielle, if you're listening. All right.
Oh, awesome.
So Fireside community, one more event to go next week with Catherine Nernberger and The Witch of I. And I thank you, as always, for your wonderful attention. I thank you, Kim, for this fantastic conversation and your wonderful book. And best of luck when Book Awards judging round 2 comes around in a few weeks. That's rapidly approaching.
Yes.
So,
well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the chance to be part of this really amazing series. And thanks to all of you who showed up tonight.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone.